I'll say that I started off as a discourse analyst, so my work is in looking at the micro-analysis of language at the turn-by-turn level. I did my graduate work at the University of Texas at Austin, and at that time in the late 90s, Texas had begun a program through the Texas Department of Criminal Justice to offer what they called mediation dialogue in crimes of severe violence to victims and offenders. And as a discourse analyst, I was particularly compelled to look at the videos of these mediations that were being done. They are not videotaping mediations there in Texas anymore, but they have an archive of lots of mediations that took place. The restorative justice movement in Texas was spurred on by crime victims and their families who wanted to have alternative avenues for talking to one another. So for my dissertation, I focused on the turn-by-turn interactions of mediations, looking particularly at how apology and forgiveness were discussed by victims of crime. The victims are usually family members because the actual victims themselves were dead. And so that's what makes these cases of mediation crimes of severe violence. In Texas, the process for starting the mediation, for initiating the mediation, is that victims request through the justice system the opportunity to meet with their offenders. And then the Victim Services Office goes to the offender to ask if the offender would like to take part. These are all post-conviction. I know some of you are working with juveniles in restorative justice, so this defines the programs that I've primarily worked with as post-conviction rather than pre-conviction or the diversion programs that are sometimes used with juvenile offenders and also crimes of less severe violence or property crimes. So today my talk focuses on communication issues in restorative justice, and I'm writing an article at the moment that I hope to get done in the next month or so. So I've been noticing that I've come back to this quote by Eleanor Roosevelt about the importance of talk, that we have to face the fact that either all of us are going to die together or we are going to learn to live together, and if we are going to learn to live together, we have to talk. As I was saying earlier, what drew me into looking at victim-offender mediation in crimes of severe violence is to look at the process of how people talk to one another under very difficult circumstances, but that when the parties are willing to do so and want to do so, it can be an incredibly powerful experience. So I started off doing discourse analytical work, went to Wisconsin, then started doing cases of my own through Marquette Law School. I work with law students and take on cases. Usually the cases take about 6 months to prepare and bring to a face-to-face mediation. Again, these are post-conviction cases that happen on the average 9 to 20 years after the crime occurred. I also then, from that experience, decided that working with victims and offenders is a very intimate setting, and having the opportunity then to teach in prison about restorative justice work was another avenue for talking about the communication skills that underlie the restorative justice process. I'll skip over the objectives, but my purpose today is not really to talk about what restorative justice is, but to talk more about the role of communication in restorative justice. So moving from an emphasis of the impact of restorative justice to looking at the process, or the how question of how restorative justice moves forward. There are many definitions of restorative justice. This is one by Howard Zehr that's often used in the field. Restorative justice aims to repair harm that's caused by crime, and that's accomplished through cooperative programs. Of the many programs that tout themselves as restorative justice, victim offender mediation is probably the most visible. We hear the most about that on programs like Oprah or Dr. Phil. But there are many different programs, and it's important to note that they can occur, restorative intervention can occur on a continuum, pre-conviction, post-conviction. As some of you mentioned, there's a big movement now to offer restorative justice programs in schools. So like the peer mediation programs in many schools, restorative justice is kind of the next step that people are interested in. A guiding principle of restorative justice is that those who are directly involved in the crime take part. So a way that this is illustrated is that you see a triangle that has the victim, community, and the offender as the integral parts of a restorative justice meeting. And the point of these encounters are to allow participants to discuss the crime, to make amends, and to seek restoration. And that can happen along a number of different levels and different ways. I think restorative justice has hit this wave of interest in our high incarceration rates. I just got a flurry of emails from people about a month ago that our U.S. incarceration rate is extremely high, over 2 million. We have something like 23 million people who have reported being victims of crime in the year 2006, and of that, of 23 million, 5 million people report being victims of violent crime. So we have lots of victims and lots of offenders, and we're all community members, so the question of justice affects all of us. I often have joked before that restorative justice, it's kind of boring to make movies about, because, I mean, when you're looking at restorative justice, this is a typical scene. There's not a whole lot that seems to be happening, at least on the visual level, but on the communicative level is an extremely dynamic process. And that's what has made me so passionate about this work, is to look at how people use communication. But this part of victim-offender mediation, restorative justice, is not the only part of a restorative justice encounter. And to understand restorative justice, you have to look across many phases, from the initiation of mediation or restorative justice encounters to the end. Just to draw a little bit on communication theory for today, in our field, communication, we often use the model of a sender-receiver model of communication, which has since been dismissed as being very simplistic. It's also called the injection model, where you take a message from one person and inject it in the other. But it can be a problematic way of understanding communication. For those of us who are mediators and who want to participate in restorative justice programs, I think we understand that communication doesn't follow this model. And so a different way of looking at communication that's particularly important in restorative encounters is a collaborative meaning-making approach. And that's why in the field I think you're seeing a shift from like a restorative justice mediation to the term restorative justice dialogue. And that seems to be something in vogue. When I was in Texas in the 90s, the program was called Victim Offender Mediation / Dialogue. But now I've been hearing Mark Umbright and others use the term dialogue much more frequently. So as a communication scholar, then, I'm interested in how people are using that word dialogue. What does it mean to say that we are in dialogue with one another? Well, dialogue can mean that you're advancing understandings, creating connections, opening new perspectives, and promoting positive changes. As the field of restorative justice takes hold, there's a need to train people on the skills that make restorative justice happen. And for me, that's understanding the communicative competencies that people have to undertake mediations or peacemaking circles or school programs. And so those communicative competencies are what I'll be talking about. Communicative competence is a term that's used in the second language acquisition field that talks about the idea that you're not just learning the rules and the grammar of a language, but you're learning the ways to use the language appropriately to cohesively put the language together. And so what I'll be talking about are communicative competencies in restorative justice. Within that process, the facilitator's role is key. And that it's key because the facilitator not only educates the parties who are going to be interacting with one another, but also models those communication skills. In the dialogic process of talking with one another, the mediator has a central role. A paradox in restorative justice, though, is the idea that Mark Umbright suggests, and that's that the facilitator in restorative justice programs gets out of the way and lets people dialogue with one another. So there's a bit of a recognition that the facilitator has a different role than in mediation. Those of us who have been trained in the typical mediation model where you do opening statements and questioning and talk about brainstorming and all those parts of the mediation perhaps see restorative justice and or you can't just take that mediation model and apply it to a restorative justice encounter. And I think that's what Umbright means by having the facilitator get out of the way. And as we'll talk about, the facilitator in the process of educating and preparing people to meet together works on modeling communication skills that are central to the restorative justice process. I'll just briefly mention phases of restorative dialogue. I'm using Mark Umbright a lot, and I'm sure those of you in the restorative justice field have heard his work a lot. He's out of University of Minnesota, social work, has an extreme number of articles out on restorative justice. Some of the first work that was being done on victim-offender mediation dialogue in crimes of severe violence. But he gives a nice phases of restorative dialogue model that I think is helpful in thinking about not placing all the emphasis on that face-to-face encounter in the process. So the restorative processes begin as victims initiate the process, and at this point in the field, it's pretty common practice that victims initiate, not offenders. Then as the victims and offenders initiate the process, there's a cultivation period, and in my practice that typically means working individually with the victim and with the offender for several months before the engagement. For crimes of severe violence, engagement usually means a one-time thing, and that could be 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours. It kind of, since I work with incarcerated individuals, it depends upon how much time you can get in the prison system and when count is going to happen or something like that. So that engagement period can be a couple of hours. Usually it's one time, and it doesn't mean that like a victim and offender will continue to meet. Although I've heard that victims and offenders have chosen after dialogue sessions to continue sending letters to one another. That can happen, not always. But then there's a very much overlooked phase of restorative justice programs called integration. And of course I work on high intensity cases in terms of the issues that crime victims bring to the table, and the offenders being incarcerated have their own issues on the table. But the integration phase is something that I've heard restorative justice practitioners talk about, that you never know when your case really ends because people still have questions. And in fact, just last week I got an email from a woman that I did a mediation with, a dialogue. I think I call it mediation dialogue. I'm still in a changing phase. But she was a sister of a young man. Her brother was 15 years old when he was brutally killed. And about 20 years after his death, she wanted to meet with her brother's murderer. And so we facilitated that case. And it turned out to be unique. I think a word that you often hear in restorative justice circles is every case is different. It's not cookie cutter. And so laying out the rules of restorative justice just isn't, it's not possible, I don't think, especially in terms of how the field thinks of their practice. So these are the phases of the restorative dialogue process. And for any mediator, I think we pull on communicative competency goals that you have, having knowledge of the process, managing the process, the analytical skills that you take in terms of figuring out how things will work and building empathic skills. Put up a cartoon that suggests the importance of communicative competency. This is a cartoon that shows a man in the suit who says, "Your victim is keen to meet you," standing next to who is presumably the offender, the guy in the bald head. And behind the door is, I guess, the victim with a baseball bat waiting to meet them. This is a common perception people in Texas especially had when we talked about restorative justice. You hear people say, if I got to meet my offender, I would, or my victim, my offender, they would just haul out. That has changed quite a bit in the last few years, I think there's a lot more awareness of what restorative justice is, and the preparation. Of course, everybody's needs are different, and you certainly also work with the self-selecting population in crimes of severe violence. If victims didn't think they would get something out of the interaction with their offender, they probably wouldn't be contacting someone to take part in that process. So the critical communicative competencies that I've been working on are perspective taking, listening, sympathy and empathy, storytelling, apology, and forgiveness. And I'm going to move quickly through the first three and focus more on storytelling, apologies, and forgiveness, because I think some are very familiar to those of you who work in conflict resolution processes, but they are important, and I'll bring up some examples from work that I did teaching in prison in particular to show how you can take these competencies and use them to teach on a skill-based level. So we'll start with the perspective taking. I'm sure many of you have seen pictures like this that encourage the viewer to look at a situation in two different ways. But I haven't often seen this picture. Have many of you seen this one before? I always like to stump my students with it. Do you see what the two views are? Just one? Which one do you see?
Two persons looking over the water.
And what's the other picture that some of you see? And the baby. So if you look at here's the baby's head and hands. But anyway, this is a typical perspective taking.
You can see a dove there.
You can see what?
A dove.
Oh, do you see a dove in there?
On the right hand side, and the face of the dove with the eye
And multiple perspectives that we all take.
and an egg-shaped body.
With the perspective taking skills, this can be used on a number of levels. Number one, talking about differences between retributive and restorative justice. Retributive justice being punishment-oriented justice versus restorative justice being used as a way of restoration. Restorative justice looks at that central role of the victim and meeting victims' needs. Also, I've done an activity with incarcerated individuals teaching these communicative competencies where I gave the offenders a little scenario of a crime that had occurred in the community outside of the prison. This was in Red Granite, Wisconsin, which is near Oshkosh. I was working at a male medium security prison with 30 individuals who elected to take part in the restorative justice class. So they took this scenario of a drunk driving case that had occurred outside their prison where the victim was killed. And I gave them the story and I asked them who was impacted. And I handed them those big sheets of Post-it paper. I'm sure many of you are familiar with them. And these guys kind of looked at me like, well, there's the victim. And I said, well, think more. Who else was impacted? What was the ripple effect of this crime, which is an image a lot of restorative justice people use. And I was really amazed in stepping back to watch these men think about not only the immediate victims, but also the first responders on the scene, the community members who may have been driving by at the time. And they even started talking about that the environment had been harmed because the median on the side of the road had been harmed by the fiery crash. And in talking about that, I think you really get people into a point where they can talk about different perspectives. And that's a key competency in restorative justice. The second competency is listening. In communication, I'm very guilty of this myself when teaching public speaking, which I hate to do, but I have done. But listening is often given as one of the weeks of, it's supposed to teach about listening. But you think, like, how do I really teach listening? And I skip right over it. But in conflict resolution, we all understand that listening is important. We say it often enough. Listening on two levels for facts and feelings. As mediators, we use those words like, so how does that make you feel? That question when you look at somebody tell you about something that happened and you ask, how does that make you feel? It's a way we communicatively talk about what listening is. So we show our attention by using our language. I put up a couple of techniques on listening to communicatively enact listening, reflecting questions, paraphrasing questions, observing questions, commenting on what you see and what you hear. Another practice that's becoming quite common within the restorative justice paradigm are peacemaking circles. And a key symbol in those peacemaking circles is the use of a talking piece. And the talking piece can be a very powerful way of having people, have someone hold the floor and have a moment for talking, but also to encourage others to listen. And just doing that can be a really powerful way of helping people think about talking and listening. And when I was teaching the prison class, I had a beautiful talking piece that I just bought one day randomly at the American Indian Museum. And the inmates loved it. So for those of you who are thinking about doing peacemaking circles, that talking piece can be very powerful. Of the competencies that I'm talking about today, the sympathy and empathy competency is the most difficult for me to articulate at the moment, but there is a key issue that I want to get at, and that's the difference between showing or observing that someone is suffering, but also showing that you feel that suffering. So to show sympathy is to have the realization that someone is upset and that you want to alleviate their unhappiness. You could say, I feel really sorry for you that something happened. But to be empathetic is different. It's a way of seeing someone in their own shoes. And one of the common ways I see this shift happen is during a mediation dialogue session with victims who elect, not all do, but some do elect to bring in pictures to show offenders. And it's in that moment that you have a very powerful shift in the interaction where the offender sees that ripple effect of crime and who has been impacted. Family members who never got to see their mother grow up, or the ways that people have been disfigured or hurt in a way that hasn't allowed them to live the life that they want. So that shift from feeling sympathetic to feeling empathetic is important in restorative justice to get people to a place where they can feel the impact of someone else's experience. It's also a difficult shift to talk about. And maybe the reason I think about it is restorative justice practitioners will often say there's something special about what happened in that room. I can't quite put my finger on it, but something was there. And I think that this sympathy, empathy difference is part of that. Now on to the more communicative aspects: storytelling, then apology, and then finally forgiveness. I have a clip to show about storytelling. Stories are fundamental to restorative justice programs. Often victims that I have worked with are brought to a restorative justice process in order to hear a story. So the story of what happened can be a reason that victims choose to participate. In my field, communication, we have a strong tradition of looking at narrative experience and assessing narrative along two criteria. And so I'm going to have you watch for these criteria as we view the clip that I brought in from a mediation that occurred. Two criteria: coherence, how the story fits together, and then fidelity, does the story ring true? Working with offenders before the interaction occurs in a restorative justice process entails talking about the story. How are you going to tell the story of a crime, a story of something terrible, the most terrible thing you may have done? So I'm going to show you this story that an offender told. His mediator worked for years to help him tell the story. And you will see the video of Gary, the offender who killed a young woman named Kathy. And 25 years later, he is meeting with Kathy's mother and Kathy's daughter, who was 5 years old at the time of the crime, but now she's 25. And he's going to tell them what happened for the crime. So it's an intense moment, how he killed their daughter and mother, and then also what the victim's last words were. And as you listen to the story, I want you to also think a little bit about how well the story hangs together. Is it coherent? And also, does the story ring true? And I'll tell you, for the victims in this case, the mother and the daughter, there's something about the last part that rang so true to them It gave them such peace, is what they said. It gave them peace listening to it. It's about a 4-minute clip.
We'll let you know if you get to a point where we can't listen, okay?
She's always having trouble with the station wagon. And it's on, everything I'm telling you is true. I'm not making up, I'm not trying to make myself look good or my family partner look good or anything. This is the way it went.
There was an accomplice in this crime.
She saw us having trouble, and out of curiosity, she asked what was wrong.
Can I just interrupt you long enough to ask you, where were you when this was going on?
At the gas station.
And do you know why she was at the gas station?
She was getting gas. I remember that.
She was just getting gas?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
He was just there?
At that time, she said, well, I can take y'all to Alvin if you want. Bring you back up. When the God's got true, this part was volunteered. At that time, the gun was never pulled. There was nothing, she didn't even know we had it. It was when we got close to Alvin, that's where things wound up changing. I let her down, told her where to go down a road that I knew was leading to nothing, out in pasture. And then when she asked why, Marvin pulled the gun, he had the gun on me, says, don't worry about it, just do what we're telling you.
Do you know why it went in the direction it went? I mean, can you remember back what happened?
Thought was, shooting in the leg would give us time to get away. And honestly, at first, there was no intent. It did change up, but there was no intent of killing. It was to slow her down so we could get in the car and get away and be long gone before she could tell anybody what had happened. In our minds, we felt we had no choice, about this. She's already seen our faces.
I mean, it wasn't like she pissed you off, or she was like, or y'all even had to force her to do it. She was just doing it just to be nice. And those were like pretty much the last thing she said was just why.
When she was out there and she heard me and him talking, and we had realized we'd already gone too far. She said, you can take the car, you can take the money, you take anything you want, and I won't say nothing. And then as Marvin pointed the gun towards the way, she said, I forgive you, and God will too. And then she put her head down. And if I don't remember anything else that night as clear as I did, it was that right there.
Was your mama. Down to the very last moment of her life.
So what are the things that you noticed in that story?
Well, his own emotions suggested it was true story, because it was affecting him so deeply, and you don't pry spontaneously alive unless you're really out there and really affected. Mm-hmm. Coherent, I guess it was coherent. It didn't fit.
I'll say one of the things the mediator worked with this offender on was talking about what happened in terms of the rape. And that this offender wasn't able to talk about that. He was working with his foul partner, his accomplice, and the accomplice couldn't take part in the mediation program because he had been incarcerated in like the mental ward of the hospital, so he wasn't able to participate in the program. So Gary, this offender, did the mediation. And in talking with the victim's family, they believed that Gary had the secondary role in this crime. But for Gary, talking about what happened was really difficult, and so this offender, Ellen Halbert, who works in victim services in Texas, spent a lot of time getting Gary to own that process. In one of the cases that I did, the offender who I mentioned before had killed a 15-year-old boy, talked to me a lot about the crime, and what had happened was that this kid and the offender were hanging out, and they wanted to go play out in the woods, and so the offender said, well, we left home and went to the woods and we got into this heated argument and then I killed him. And I said, you know, I think we have to talk about what that story is, because the family member is going to want to know a little bit more about what happened. And so working with that offender to put together the coherent story that rings true to the family is important. Not that you're telling someone how to tell the story, because you can't do that, but as a facilitator you can talk about how someone tells a story and what questions someone might have. The part in the case that you watched about the fidelity that rings true is that the victim's last words were, I forgive you and God will too. And so I asked Linda and Amy about that years later. This was taped in the late 90s, and I've been in touch with them since then. So we've been talking about what did that sound like? Did you believe Gary when he said that those were her last words? And immediately, without hesitation, they said yes. That's exactly how Kathy was. So it really was an unexpected moment in the mediation. They weren't planning that that would have happened. It was an unexpected moment that rang true to them. And when you look at the storytelling, I think those are the powerful moments of restorative justice. Even in cases with school children who are talking about what happened, you could talk about how do you tell a story about what happened when you stole somebody's notebook or called them a name or bullied them.
The question about the feelings, yeah, I think sometimes to sort out, this Gary had the strong feelings and was tearful, but sometimes I think part of the question has to be, is that about how he feels now, reflecting on the event, which is different possibly in a lot of ways, how he was feeling in the incident. And so as far as the truth telling, the truth becomes that he's empathetic, certainly and sympathetic now, but that may not be the true story of then. I don't know how much difference that makes in the process. But I was thinking of that as far as the believability. If he was there in that incident, feeling tearful and upset, maybe then you would ask him, well, why didn't you stop this from happening?
The emotion could distort his memory here. It seems to me the emotion suggested that this is what he believes happened.
Yeah, I think that's a difficult question for those who are hearing the story to pull apart.
There's a fine line between a lie
or wishful,
the truth,
wishful thinking.
There's a lot of in between the lie and the truth.
Similarly, it raises the question about coherence and what are all the pieces that one needs to really have a coherent narrative, in the sense that you have to understand motive. And sometimes there isn't an understandable motive, and how might the family members be protected from an act that no one even years later really can account for. Why?
For example, in this case, the boys had been doing drugs. And so then you get it to a problem then of maybe the offender can't remember because they were not in a state to remember. And at present, restorative justice practitioners I don't think have good ways of understanding how to overcome that. Is it appropriate? Will it be correct? The field has to grapple with these very deep questions of how do you talk about motive? How do you talk about appropriateness? How do you know when somebody is empathetic? These are
most importantly, what are the victim's goals really?
Right.
Having the conference, because of what are their expectations. Because in that kind of situation where they won't get a clear motive, if their expectations, some tapes I've seen as well, where it was random, where the random kid was killed in the Pizza Hut, where they were robbing the store and it was a robbery gone bad, and for them, then it's just the parents often needing to spew their venom. I mean, needing to talk about their anger and that's a little,
and I think for communication people, that's where you realize communication is maybe not enough. We can talk about everything we want, but you're just not going to get that answer that you need. So what do you do then? A case that I worked with that did not go to a face-to-face encounter involved a young woman who was assaulted by her father, sexually assaulted by her father. And we worked for several months to talk about what she might like to talk to her dad about. He had been incarcerated for over 10 years. And she did not want, after a few months, didn't think that anything she could say to him would change what he had done or maybe how he felt about it. And so we ended up not having the face-to-face encounter. What interestingly came out of that case, though, was she worked to put together a list of questions that she wanted to ask her dad about what had happened. And with her permission, I took the questions and gave them to her father. And so he had a sense of the things that were on her mind. Not just about the crime, but other aspects that a daughter would want to know about her father. For example, a question that just was so poignant to me was, do you think about me on my birthday? So you had lots of the questions, but there was something about just having her think about questions she wanted to ask. She didn't need the answer, and it wasn't the answer for her in the end to ask him those questions, but to propose the questions and then for him to hear the questions. I thought that was successful, but no, didn't have an outcome. So
he didn't answer it. He didn't write it.
No, he didn't give her the answers. It was powerful. The last two things I'll talk about have to do with apology and forgiveness because they are flashpoint communication topics in restorative justice. How do you apologize? And the apology gets to the paradox of using language to say something when you know words don't suffice. So for my dissertation work, I took victim and offender accounts in mediations and looked at how people used apology and forgiveness. Restorative justice practitioners often cite that crime victims want apologies from their offenders, and those apologies are probably genuine apologies, that they're talking about apologies that show that someone is accountable and responsible for their crime. I'll just briefly mention here that some new programs I've seen in Minnesota and in Wisconsin are apology letter programs that are used for incarcerated offenders to write an apology letter to their victims. And the apology letters go into a data bank, not to be given to the victims. If the victims request the letter from victim services and the letter happens to be there, the offender chose to write the letter, then the victim might read it. But they're really used as a way for offenders to work on an apology without the end point being that that apology will necessarily get to the victim. But restorative justice practitioners in the Department of Corrections in Minnesota are working on this, and they have this apology letter repository. So some of the apologies that I looked at in the Texas program show that paradox of how communication is maybe not enough. And here this is an offender who killed 2 young high school students in a drunk driving case. And he confronted or encountered with them, he had an encounter with one of the mothers of the victims. And he said to her, and what we'll focus on here is that he realizes his language isn't enough. He says, I hope somewhere down the line my actions will show y'all that I really am sincere about how sorry I am for what happened, what I've caused, what I've done. no words or actions can really change anything or make anything better, but I'm hoping somewhere down the line, though, that y'all can see something good about me, that I've accomplished something for myself, because that's all I can do. And those were the types of apologies that I found in the Texas program for the offender. Accepting responsibility and accountability, but also recognizing how difficult it is to give that apology. And talking to offenders about how to apologize can be very powerful in terms of preparing people for that mediation. I sometimes have used a clip of a Green River killer who was a serial killer in the Seattle area who gave an apology statement at his sentencing. It's a very hollow apology. And using an apology that seems hollow, not genuine, doesn't take responsibility for the actions, puts everything into a passive voice, letting people hear that and then compare that to what they might find to be in a genuine apology, or a so-called genuine apology, can be a nice activity or technique to use. And finally, forgiveness. There was an episode of Dr. Phil several months ago now where Dr. Phil encouraged strongly a victim and an offender to undergo victim-offender mediation, is what he called it, but he forced the victim to apologize to the offender. And the professional organization that I'm a member of, Victim Offender Mediation Association, VOMA, was up in arms over this. And in part, I think it responds to a real concern that the public has about restorative justice. Is it just about getting forgiveness? There is probably a link between restorative justice and forgiveness. When you talk about restoring or repairing, you know, you can't restore or repair, but there is something about coming together that is inherent in restorative justice and perhaps forgiveness. There's an intriguing line of psychological research now that talks about health benefits of forgiveness: reduction in anxiety, stress, depression, anger, and grief. Interestingly, these are not predicated on face-to-face encounters, but through forgiveness therapies where people learn about forgiveness. Restorative justice programs, for the most part, in my experience, from what I've seen here in the United States, view forgiveness as a choice. And when I looked at forgiveness in the cases that I analyzed, I saw an interesting way that people used forgiveness. And so I just wanted to share one example with you that I've termed interpersonal forgiveness. And it maybe goes back to the idea that victims self-select to be part of these programs, and that they're, for those people who find it to be an outlet that's useful to them, interpersonal forgiveness is something about coming face to face to talk. So this is a mother who met with the offender who killed her son. She said, "Well, you asked what I would get out of this. What I would get out of this is you being here." She's talking to the offender. "It's all I was expecting, and just to talk to you and to tell you face to face I have forgiven you and I need you to forgive yourself." So for her, that face-to-face moment was really important. And in thinking about what forgiveness means in dialogue encounters, for some people, this idea of coming face-to-face to offer or talk about forgiveness is there. I will say, though, not every case talks about forgiveness.
My understanding, even in my training, has been more that restorative justice, just as you say about forgiveness, is a choice, not an expectation. The same holds true for an apology. Is a choice, not an expectation. That the goal of restorative justice should not be an apology or forgiveness.
Right. I would agree with that.
Yeah, I do.
But they are questions for some people that they are thinking of. So being prepared as a facilitator to talk about what is apology and what is forgiveness and how do you want to talk about that, if at all, may be an important part of a facilitator's set of skills.
Thinking about a wonderful article written by our colleague here, Mark Gobin, about forgiveness in different religious traditions and forgiveness, and I'm sure that other people have written, particularly about the kinds of special meanings of forgiveness coming out of Christian practice, for example.
Right.
And I'm just wondering, in what you just said about telling them what forgiveness is, I mean, how deep do you go in some of the...
Yeah, I don't mean to tell them what forgiveness is,
but
to
just
talk about what forgiveness would mean to you.
Right. But then if you think about something that, Gopa would say, that forgiveness really is a very, very different thing. I mean, to do unilateral forgiveness as a practicing Christian of a certain sort really has a certain meaning that would be very different if somebody else was in the room saying the same words. So I'm just curious of how our wonderful theories about this stuff, where do they make it? How far do they go in the conversations, for example, that somebody prepping an individual offender to hear forgiveness might say? Where you're up in the, they can understand it however they're going to understand it.
Another layer of that is the religious dimension. And in Texas, I had a number of comments about this. In Texas, do you get a particular type of religious orientation to what forgiveness is? So spiritual talk within restorative dialogue has the opportunity, it's an opportunity to pull people together, but it can also pull people apart if you don't speak the same spiritual language. And that's another area that is not well researched in terms of putting people in face-to-face encounter to talk about these difficult issues. I just end by talking a little bit about the reflective practitioner, which is a term that we use in the conflict analysis field, about being attuned to parties' needs and adaptable, building trust and respect through dialogue. But in my own work, I do think that facilitator role of teaching or facilitating discussions about these communicative competencies that underlie the process of restorative justice are really important to the outcome. We know a lot about the outcome of restorative justice programs. There are great meta-analyses that look at our victims and offenders, both in severe and what are called minor cases. People don't like that distinction, but in the crime literature you see that distinction. But both in these post-conviction programs and diversion programs with juveniles, you see that victims and offenders are satisfied by restorative justice. They think the process is fair, and that's particularly relating to diversion programs where there's some kind of an outcome or sentence. And that you can lower recidivism, or the rate at which you have reoffense, by implementing restorative justice programs. We know about those outcomes, and that's upheld in the literature. It's asking these questions about the process that I find myself thinking about quite a bit and working on. So I'll stop there. Thank you for coming. I think we have time for questions, if anyone.
A real sort of nuts and bolts. First, let me just say that the work is just fascinating. Really, it's a wonderful approach that you're taking to an important form. Nuts and bolts. The beginning, you showed the picture of the dialogue and said it's not so visual. And I know what you meant by that, but I want to ask a question about visual, because you're hearing the words, but it seems to me the actual encounter of seeing this person, of being close to this person, of watching, of trying to figure out their demeanor from every move they make and how they look at you and how they don't. So I was just wondering, in the work that you're doing, are you dealing with the paralinguistic stuff? Because I used to do work on language in courtrooms, and we just used, the audio tapes at that point, partly because of the restrictions in court. And now there's more visual data available, but the analysis is sort of a
difficult,
totally different thing. So how are you dealing with that? That's the nuts and bolts question.
I wish I was dealing with it more.
It's really hard.
Yeah. But the eye contact is fascinating. In the cases I've done, that moment that either the offender or victim enters the room first or second, depending on what they've decided beforehand, the eye contact in setting the stage for getting people to talk is so powerful. And I have written an article about how the mediator's role in the opening statements, and how the mediator is acting in a particular way in those moments. And that is where the mediator's role is not to get out of the way, but to bring people together in a way that's much more powerful than what we see in traditional opening statements of mediators. That article is in Conflict Resolution Quarterly.
But even in that one we saw, I wondered, having the young woman directly across from Gary, as opposed, even just who's directly across. Sometimes I'll see people, the more confrontive, I'll sit as one over rather than directly across from the offender. So I think, those lines of vision get really.
And sometimes you don't have a lot of control over the physical setting in the prison. You kind of take what you get. We were working in Wisconsin. I worked in the parole hearing room, which brought up a lot of feelings for offenders and for victims who had come into parole hearings to that room over the years. Their big table. But I also have been thinking a lot about that these encounters in restorative justice dialogues are not the only time that victims see their offenders. In the courtroom, in these parole hearings, there are a lot of encounter points where people are drawing information.
Can you say something about the current evaluative findings on victim offender?
The ones that are most used in the field are those meta-analyses that I talked about at the end: fairness, satisfaction, recidivism.
What are they finding?
Good results.
Lower rates.
Yeah.
Okay. What about the victim? What is the impact on
By and large, victims report being satisfied by the process.
them? You get some answers, you think? You get some closure? You get closer to forgiveness?
I don't think it's closure, although a lot of people use that word. I think it's a step along the journey. And in the cases of crimes of severe violence, it can be a time to ask and answer some questions. But I think closure is difficult to talk about because there's never an end to the journey.
Just on that, why do people continue to talk about closure when it is so it's so very clear to some who have experienced it and to others who are practitioners who have seen so much? Why does that continue?
Probably we want that end. You want to have that end point.
Relief.
The relief.
Well, I think there are many intermediate steps, aren't there?
Yeah.
If people obsess less, have they tried to measure that sort of thing?
No.
Dissatisfaction. It's kind of a gross measure. I had a broader question. When you talk about restorative justice, I thought about some early articles that called restorative justice just simply arranging for the victim to do something to help restore the problem. To actually, and they wouldn't be murdered, but crime of stealing or something like that, for the victim to do some work for the.
Like community service alternative.
I'm sorry, for the defendant to do some work for the victim. I'm wondering if that's gone anywhere.
I'm not sure.
I believe it's done frequently, actually. In young, or like the 16 to 21 age group offenders, breaking and entering, assault, destruction of property, vandalism, theft, those kinds of things very often. Deals are brokered sort of at these things, and they come out with a plan of when this individual may go and help with yard work, repaint the fence, do something.
That's part of the sentence.
I don't know, I call it as part of the sentence. As
Yeah,
part
community
of
service.
Yeah.
Often community service.
No, this isn't when it's official, that's not what I'm talking about.
It's not part of a court hearing.
There are times when it has to be given to the courts as a written agreement. There are other times where it's not mandated. But it's come out of it.
It's certainly part of our American culture, I think, to think about ways that you can use actions to repair the harm.
Certainly it's part of diversion.
Yeah.
And there are maybe monetary things as well.
when you spend a lot of time in prison with people, that you do feel that the sense offenders have of wanting to do something to make up for what they have done, but they realize they can't really do anything in prison, although there are creative alternatives to developing, like the programs in Wisconsin where they knit little caps for preemie babies, and channeling your energy into doing something to give back. We certainly have that as a...
Would that be considered restorative justice?
There are debates about whether that is actually restorative justice. In my mind it is, because it's working to make things better.
And what, besides victim offender, what else is usually classified as restorative?
They call it conferencing, which is usually done with juvenile cases. Conferencing and peacemaking circles. Those are some of the programs I've worked with. I'm kind of drawing a blank. Any other? Is it like teaching skills, or restorative justice skills and mediation?
Yeah, part of the for me, part of it is what the conceptual roots of this are. And so, sometimes the questions about what is restorative coming out of our traditional way of thinking about law and what happens, I think distorts that the roots of restorative practice is really out of Native American and other societies, that the restoration is to become part of the community again. And so sort of that greater goal is for you, not, because I think if you get into specific harm done and frame it in our current law system, it's still really a it's a different model. And so I think, at least for me, the restorative part overall is about belonging to the community again, and how do you do the longer process for that.
I'm glad you brought that up, and we probably have to end, but I do think in these crimes of severe violence, you have to see restorative justice and the traditional criminal justice system as complementary. Because the idea of, oh, well, you're just going to mow that lawn for those people for the rest of your life, there is a relationship between a justice system that often or potentially has to be punitive, probably goes along. Those are difficult questions to figure out. But thank you for coming.